En avant, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs de ce colloque et aussi l'École française d'Athènes et aussi les directeurs du musée épigraphique pour leur assistance. I'm so bad with technology, probably more things will fall apart, but so I'll need help. Statue bases have always proven indispensable as documentary evidence for Greek freestanding sculpture. Studying them for the practical information they provide is not at all incompatible with appreciating their aesthetic qualities. But even when the statues are no longer there to draw our attention, the material dimensions of bases are easily taken for granted. This is true even in the case of the material most strongly associated with classical Athens, Pentelic marble. I will begin this talk by sketching a very brief history of the use of Pentelic in Athenian statue bases from the Archaic through the late Hellenistic periods, with a focus on the Acropolis. Next, I will move from use to reuse. When we think of the reuse of Pentelic marble in Athens, chances are we think of late antique structures built of spolia after major destructions. One example is the Boulay Gate below the Acropolis, constructed to serve as part of the post-Herulian fortification system of the 3rd century AC. Another is the repair to the west door of the Parthenon after a fire sometime before AD 450, for which a total of 80 Pentelic statue bases, stelae, and architectural elements were deployed. These and other cases of reuse in later periods seem eminently practical in the face of difficult circumstances. Most of the Pentelic blocks in the Boulay Gate come from a single dismantled building, the 4th century Choregic monument of Nicias. The selective reuse of Pentelic marble statue bases in Athens, however, began long before this, in the 2nd or the 1st century BC. In the second part of this paper, I will focus on one particular episode of such reuse in the Julio-Claudian period to demonstrate how, over time in Athens, the material became an important part of the message. Before I proceed, a word of caution. When I talk about statue bases, I will largely be relying upon visual identification of Pentelic rather than scientific analysis, a method that may seem inadequate or even irresponsible. The possible pitfalls are by now well known. White Hymedian marble, used in some archaic statues as well as the metapiece of the H architecture on the Acropolis, has sometimes been mistaken for white Pentelic. All the same, what will matter most in the reuse part of this talk is that observers of later periods looked at earlier statue bases and thought they were made of Pentelic. After hundreds of years, statue bases, like the 5th century Acropolis buildings, would have developed their telltale golden tone as they weathered. Visual identification of white Pentelic statue bases under these circumstances seems justified, especially when they can be compared easily with gray-blue Hymedian and other stones nearby. I hope later to verify some of the observations I make now with scientific testing. It may be a cliche to say that the use of Pentelic marble in Athens for other purposes was a direct consequence of the construction of the older Parthenon out of Pentelic, but it seems to be true. Some late archaic chori made of fine-grained Parian I marble were combined with base elements in Pentelic, but generally speaking, on the Acropolis before circa 480, Parian was preferred for column bases and for all but the plainest of pillars. Between 480 and the end of the 5th century, however, it's difficult to find statue bases in Athens made of anything but Pentelic marble. It seems likely, though at present impossible to prove, that both statue bases and stelae were fashioned first from the remains of the unfinished older Parthenon project, and later on from the byproducts of the Periclean building program. Bronze sculptors such as Critias and Nesiotes, and later Chrysalas of Cydonia, placed their statues on randomly shaped and sized pieces of Pentelic intended to look architectural in origin. This round base sign by Critias and Nesiotes is much smaller than any of the older Parthenon's column drums, but But on the statue bases with the signatures of Critias and Nesiotes, stippled surface treatments, such as the one we see here, and lifting bosses made the visual connection with contemporary Pentelic architecture. As Olga Pelagia has noted, the cult statue bases of Phidias and his students in Athens usually combined dark Eleusinian limestone with smaller elements in white Pentelic for color contrast. Ordinary Athenian statue bases of the classical period adopted strategies for the use of Pentelic, more clearly analogous to the strategies used in classical Athenian architecture. As in buildings such as the Propylaea, the primary elements were made of white Pentelic, with dark Eleusinian limestone and later gray-blue Hymedian marble relegated to subsidiary roles or used as accents. The inscription was usually carved on one of the Pentelic elements. The remains of the early 4th century base for the portraits of Conon and Timotheus on the Acropolis illustrates this principle well. The statue stood on a top step of Eleusinian limestone with the inscription on the Pentelic step below it. Gray-blue Hymedian first appeared in Athenian architecture in the late 5th century, and by the end of the 4th century, as Rice Townsend has shown, it had become the dominant element in many Athenian buildings. For stelae, statue bases, and the like, the second half of the 4th century marks a real shift to Hymedian as the default material, and this seems to hold true for the entire Hellenistic period, as well as the 1st century AC. Where did all the Pentelic marble go? Pelagia refers to an aggressive export policy for Pentelic beginning in the 4th century. Pentelic was exported in large quantities not only to Delphi and Epidaurus, but also to Olympia for repairs to the roof of the classical Zeus temple, to Asia Minor for the Mausoleon, and eventually to Rome for peripteral temples, such as the round temple next to the Forum Boarium seen here. By the mid-2nd century BC, however, Pentelic was back in use for major building projects in Athens itself. First for the revival of the Olympiaeon project by Antiochus IV in 175 BC, and then for the Stoa of Attalus in mid-century. To see what effect these big 2nd century building projects might have had upon statue bases in Athens, as an experiment, I looked at 4 of the Athenian sculptural workshops most active in this period to see which marble they used for their bases. The Polycles family of the Deme Thorikos, Auker and Aubulides, Demetrius Pteleasios, and finally Kaikosthenes and Dies. The results? Perhaps the least distinguished of these sculptors, Kaikosthenes and Dies, were the ones who used Pentelic marble most. All 7 of their surviving bases, all found in Athens, seem to be Pentelic, including this pillar capital found near the Theater of Dionysus. And I'm sorry it's impossible to see the inscription, but it's there. So Kaikosthenes and Dies are the ones who seem only to be using Pentelic for their bases. 2 other unexpected things emerged when I did this. Stephen Tracy has associated one of the bases signed by Kaikosthenes and Dies with an Athenian letter cutter. This is his cutter of IG 2 squared 788, whose work he dates much earlier, to circa 260 to 235 BC. Since none of the Kaikosthenes and Dies bases has a firm date, Tracy suggests that nothing prevents an earlier date for the entire ensemble, quote. I wonder, though, if these sculptors' use of Pentelic is in itself a reason to keep their dates lower than Tracy wants to put them. Recent studies of the Pentelic quarries by Scott Pike find that they were near dormant throughout the second half of the 3rd century. So here we seem to have a conflict between this redating here and lack of use of Pentelic in this part of the 3rd century. The second thing I noticed is that even the very distinguished Polycles and his sons in the second half of the 2nd century BC were on occasion reusing older Pentelic marble bases for their statues. This strikes me as a strange choice and one that I can't easily explain. In late Hellenistic and early imperial Athens, Pentelic for statue bases remained less common than Hymedian, but at the same time, ad hoc, opportunistic reuse of older Pentelic bases is well attested. It's worth looking once again at the best known example of this kind of ad hoc reuse. The base for the Pandites and Pazicles family group, portrait group of the second half of the 4th century BC, it may have looked attractive for reuse because it featured 5 matching blocks of Pentelic on its inscribed middle step, ideal for a group of imperial family portraits: Augustus, Tiberius, Germanicus, and Drusus, with room to add Trajan a century later. We simply don't know what became of the original 4th century statues, but they were clearly gone by the early 1st century AC. But why not just quarry 5 new blocks of Pentelic for these imperial portraits? The original 4th century inscriptions on the backs of the blocks were left visible, and one of the names carved on them was that of the Athenian sculptor Leochares. Perhaps the old inscriptions were considered a positive feature, and one worth highlighting and preserving through reuse. Before moving on, I should note, though, that elsewhere in the Greek world in the early imperial period, local authorities struggled to come up with appropriate sets of matching bases for Julio-Claudian family portraits. At Lindos on Rhodes, an 11-block exedra was reused to support portraits of the very same subjects: Augustus, Tiberius, Germanicus, and Drusus. In the time I have left, I would like to describe briefly a program of reuse in the Julio-Claudian period, which confirms that on the Acropolis, Pentelic marble statue bases were being stockpiled for later reuse. Stockpiling in late antiquity is implied by the repairs to the Parthenon that I mentioned earlier. There, the blocks used included several 5th century BC statue bases. Despite claims by authors such as Dio Chrysostom and Pausanias that the Emperor Nero pillaged the major Greek sanctuaries, the episode of base reuse on the Acropolis I'm about to describe clearly dates before Nero. And I must stress again that we don't know what happened to any of the original statues. So this begins with an historical reference that is so slight and so obscure, there's no reason why anyone would ever have noticed it had it not been confirmed by epigraphy. According to Cassius Dio, the Emperor Claudius, as a gesture of goodwill at the beginning of his reign, restored statues that had been removed by his predecessor, Gaius Caligula. The 19th century Acropolis excavations turned up pieces of 7 Pentelic marble statue bases, 6 of them inscribed with the exact same text. The text shows that these bases were reused to support the statues Claudius gave back to Athens: Tiberius Claudius Caesar Sebastos Germanicos, auargetes tes poleos, ekarisito kai apokatestesen. The lettering of these inscriptions, which I'm about to show you, varies in size and quality. All in all, one gets a sense of haste and improvisation. This is precisely where I think earlier discussions of these bases has gone astray. The assumption has been that when Claudius returned the statues taken by Gaius only a few years before, the Athenians put them back on top of their original bases. After looking at this material, I consider it more likely that the officials in charge of the Acropolis searched through their Pentelic marble stockpiles for surviving base blocks appropriate for reuse. This small pillar, with its back sliced off in modern times for reuse as a threshold block, originally supported a modest votive dedication by an Athenian named Epicrates Epicarus of Halae in the 1st quarter of the 4th century BC. So that's in blue. The large Claudius inscription below is difficult to see in my photo because it's now so worn down. Yeah, you actually can see a sigma in the second line. It's really there. Whatever the statue dedicated by Epicrates was, it seems an unlikely candidate for plunder by Gaius. Indeed, it's worth questioning whether the statue had survived into the 1st century AC at all. The pillar might simply have been empty and thus available for reuse at an opportune moment. Another base was reused in a way that shows little regard for its original function, a sure sign that what it was originally was not considered important. This is the one example that doesn't use the standard formula. Instead, we see apoton, we don't know, Tiberius Claudius Caesar apokatestesen. I would very much like to fill in the blank here, apoton what? And I'm open to suggestions. This block would have been well over a meter long originally, and it looks very much like the inscribed Pentelic course of a large late classical or early Hellenistic stepped base. The original inscription, though, has been completely chiseled out, an unlikely thing to do if the Athenians were putting the statues restored by Claudius back on their own bases. After examining this base, I suspect that 2 or more of the statues Claudius returned were displayed together on the same block. In addition, anathoroses on both sides suggest that this block was combined with 2 others to support a whole row of statues that Claudius gave back. And now my final example. This pillar capital found on the Acropolis seems to have been made to support a portrait of a Roman woman named Sempronia Atratina Paula, here identified by a nominative name label, and that's the top inscription. Mika Kayava convincingly identifies her as the daughter and the wife of the 2 Roman consuls of 34 BC. The relative newness of this monument makes it all the more surprising that the statue was already gone 75 years later when the pillar capital was reused. We need to remember, though, that Roman plunder was not the only danger to public statues in Athens. In this particular case, Sempronia's male relatives were partisans of Marcus Antonius in the 30s BC, which makes me wonder if her portrait had become an embarrassment in the time of Augustus. Natural processes of attrition could also cause significant damage, even over a short period of time, potentially resulting in the removal of statues from display, leaving behind blocks of Pentelic marble available for reuse. To sum up, a full history of Athenian statue bases remains to be written. Even if we trace the quarrying of Pentelic marble for Athenian architecture as well as for export, it is difficult to explain why gray blue Hymedion overtook Pentelic as the preferred material for statue bases in the Hellenistic period. I've suggested here, leaving several unanswered questions along the way, that in the late Hellenistic and early imperial periods, older blocks of Pentelic were chosen for reuse for several possible reasons, an important one being that they were valued for their historical associations. A process of stockpiling and recycling that was in some ways practical was simultaneously aesthetic and symbolic. The material had become an important part of the message. Thank you.